and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Mike Hemsley. I'm Deputy Director of the Energy Transitions Commission, and I've got a great panel with me today to discuss solutions to the challenges of the energy transition, innovation, technology, disruption, and collaboration. We've got about an hour together. What I'm going to do is set the scene, and then I'm going to quiz our panelists here on some of these challenges and solutions, and we're going to leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for any questions from you. So hopefully you can start thinking about those as we go through.
The volume is quite low. Is that happening for the audience as well, or I struggle a little bit hearing you? So if it's possible to turn the volume up slightly, or?
We hear you very well.
Is it me?
Mike, not so much. Yeah.
Okay, maybe it's the...
Yeah, maybe I need to speak a bit louder.
Maybe it's your microphone or the volume.
I can hear myself. Yeah.
I hear it, but I felt it was a very low volume.
Well, let's continue, but do shout if it's an issue. So I'm joined today by Professor Jim Skee, who's the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but I know also has a history of working in innovations. He's got other things to talk about as well as that work. We've got Ross Brutton, who's the head of ventures from the Carbon Trust. We've got Shannon Smith, who's the CCO at Chestnut Carbon. We've got Emin Bata Dizdar, who's the co-founder and CEO of Ratio Energy. And we've got Øystein Jensen, who's the chief sustainability officer of Ujfel SE. So just before we get into this then, allow me to set the scene. The organization I work for is called the Energy Transitions Commission, and we are a global leadership coalition which basically produces analysis to try and accelerate the energy transition. We think global net zero by mid-century is completely and absolutely possible, and we try and produce analysis demonstrating why we think that can happen and how we can overcome some of the challenges to scaling that. What we believe is that in order to get to net zero by mid-century, you need a massive scale-up in low-carbon electricity, because that's been the great success story of the transition to date. Cheap solar, cheap wind, cheap batteries. And you need to scale that up substantially so that electricity moves from something like 20% of final energy demand today to something like 60 to 70% overall by 2050. In that remaining 30 to 40% then, you need low-carbon hydrogen. Most of that, again, provided by cheap renewables, wind, solar. But you also have a role for sustainable bioenergy and fossil fuels using carbon capture, utilization, and storage at the same time. And that's just decarbonizing the energy system. You also need a scale-up of carbon dioxide removals alongside that to get the net in net zero overall. So just to tease out some of the challenges we see in that overall, can you scale up wind and solar that quickly, that everywhere across the world? Can you scale up the grids, storage and flexibility options alongside wind and solar to make them work as well? Can you make low carbon hydrogen as cheap as high carbon hydrogen? And can you do that quickly so you can start using it in industrial applications? Can you get truly sustainable bioenergy? Can you actually scale carbon and capture, because the experience to date is very limited? And can you get serious money into carbon dioxide removals to make sure that they're scaling to get, again, that net in net zero? So hopefully the scene is set. Maybe let's just start with a very brief introduction from each of the panelists. Literally, who are you and what do you and your organization do? And then we'll move into a few more questions around innovation and the overall theme of this. Jim, can I start with you?
Okay, thanks, Mike. So as you said in your introduction, I'm chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we necessarily take a very global view of this challenge. So I would divide the challenges that we'll be facing in the next cycle of IPCC, which started about a year ago. 3 challenges. We have, as Mike said, been enormously successful with renewable energy, but most of that development has been concentrated in Europe, North America and China. And the big challenge is to spread that out in other parts of the world. And there are 2 obstacles, I think, that need to be addressed. One is the availability of infrastructure, which will allow renewables to be brought onto systems. And the second one is the high cost of capital. The cost of borrowing money in many developing countries is high and is acting as a barrier. So that's spreading out of renewables as one. Second point, we tend to, when we talk about energy, we talk about energy supply. Energy demand is going to be extremely important as well. So putting in place measures in the transport system, industrial systems, buildings is going to be incredibly important. And the final one, which Mike dropped the hints about, was the question of the net in net zero. We will not get to net zero until we take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to compensate for difficult sectors. So that is something that's going to be very important for us. So we're just going to have a meeting in Vienna next week on that subject. But just remember, this isn't only about energy. When it comes to carbon dioxide removal, land-based removals are going to be incredibly important as well. And there's a lot of work to be done there.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jim. Ross, over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Ross Bruton from the Carbon Trust. We've been in this industry for about 25 years now. We do a variety of different aspects within the industry, but we're primarily focused on developing net zero strategies for corporates, governments and institutions to effectively meet and implement these strategies to get to net zero. We work both on the deployment angle, so I think a lot of the technologies and systems that have been spoken about already that need to be scaled as mature technologies within the sector is really important. And we do a lot of work in understanding what that system transformation needs to look like, what are the barriers around that, and actually running and implementing projects to actually make those facilities a success. The other side of the work that we do is really with early stage innovation. So the IEA, as an example, has predicted that approximately 50 to 70% of the emission reductions that we need to achieve by 2050 to get to net zero are for technologies that are still in early prototyping stage or still in a high level of immaturity. So we really need that early stage pipeline of leading technologies to get us there as well. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Ross. And Shannon.
Good afternoon. I'm Shannon Smith. I am our Chief Commercial Officer for Chestnut Carbon, and I feel like Jim gave an excellent introduction for why we are here. We are an afforestation carbon credit developer. So we are right now focused exclusively in the US, and we are purchasing marginal crop and pasture land and restoring native forests. And that is the basis for long-term carbon offtake contracts that we are selling to sustainably focused organizations that do want that carbon removal part of their net zero overall portfolio. So we are nature-based carbon offsets, which we very much believe need to be a part of the solution right now, because so many of the technologies that will be part of the solution are not scaled or even kind of really working or certain at this point. So trees are, and so that's why we've decided to invest in trees for now, and so our company is Chestnut Carbon.
Thanks very much, Shannon. Always worth a reminder that we do have scalable carbon dioxide removal technologies at the moment, and they're called trees. Emin.
Yeah, my name is Emin from Ratio Energy. I'm kind of representing the tech side here today. As all my friends here said that when you think about renewable energy transition, right now it's really impossible to decouple that from the concept of technology. And we are a hands-on developer on energy management softwares, and we're trying to actually facilitate the process for energy investors and people with money to have a better understanding of how to invest in renewable energy projects, and we try to streamline the process of financing those energy projects by providing energy feasibility analysis, energy simulations, and also after the investment, we try to make sure that even without any know-how to managing a renewable energy asset, you would have the tools to make it for you, like with the improvement of AI in this day and age. AI can actually manage all these energy assets for you and get you the most money out of the system. That's what we are trying to achieve, and that's what we are trying to help for the energy transition.
Excellent. Thanks, Emin. And Øystein, can I hand to you?
Yes, my name is Øystein Jensen. I'm from the company Odfjell. We are a shipping company, a global shipping company. We are located in Bergen in Norway. And we operate a large fleet of chemical tankers. And hence I represent the polluting industry and the hard-to-abate sector. Today there's really no alternative than a combustion engine if you're going to do deep sea transportation. And when you're crossing the Pacific with a chemical tanker or a tank ship, it's not possible to do that with hydrogen. It's not possible to do that with batteries. But there are alternative fuels going, and so that is the kind of the big challenge that we are looking at. And as you say in your introduction also, and I think that that's the question that we get the most, what do you believe is going to be the future fuel? The short answer is that we are fuel agnostic, and the longer answer is that I think that there will be multiple of fuel. But I also think that there's a lot of other challenges behind the alternative fuels, and that comes back to the energy production. So to green energy, which I can elaborate more on. But that's us, and that's what we see as the big challenge.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. A great panel, but let's get into some of the questions and discussion now. Quite an open-ended one to start with, which I'll ask all panelists. But interesting, what do you see as the main challenges around scaling both innovation and technology in order to address this overall global net zero transition? Jim, can I start with you?
Yeah. Well, in a way, I answered that question in my introductory remarks, because I think spreading out and getting a wider take-up of renewable energy is absolutely critical. I think in terms of innovation, some of the biggest challenges and some of the hardest work is around what has already been called the hard-to-abate sectors. I'm thinking of sectors like steel and cement, which will play a big role in energy transition, because we need the kits there in order to make the transition. And getting these sectors to be low or zero carbon, I think, is going to be an incredibly big challenge. They're difficult sectors because they're all exposed to international competition, which means they face a higher cost of capital, and it's sometimes more difficult to get over these barriers. So these would be my areas.
So the hard-to-abate sectors are called hard-to-abate for a reason. We still think they're hard to abate, and that's a challenge for each of them.
And of course, the other challenge is people. We can't do this all by technology. It does involve some kind of behavioural change as well, and that's probably even more difficult than the technology.
Yes, certainly. Ross, can I pass to you on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just echoing Jim's comments, and I think some of your comments in the beginning, Mike, the large majority of the emission reductions that we've achieved to date, and some of them look quite impressive when you look at a country level, has happened within the energy sector. So that social movement and social change, as well as these hard-to-abate sectors, are essentially the next frontier and the nut that we ultimately need to crack to continue towards net zero. Maybe I can give a comment more from early stage innovators that we work with. So we, at any one point in time, are working with over 400 innovators across a variety of different technical sectors that are ultimately trying to take their technologies and bring them to market. And it can be increasingly difficult within the climate space, particularly within hard-to-abate sectors, when there's a lot of money going into innovators, there's a lot of venture capital going into innovation. In fact, we're one of the top in the world in the UK in venture capital investment into climate tech, and huge amount of public finance going into innovation. But these sectors need to innovate as well, right? We need to move to a point that where these technologies become commercially ready, they have value chains, they have policy alignment, so that they're actually able to implement that technology, access the funding that they need through a de-risking of that solution, and then ultimately being able to scale into those sectors. We see so many innovators coming out of our programs with tried and tested technologies. This sits within the hydrogen space, it sits within the CCUS space, and a variety of different others, biomass, innovation, feedstock, that are ready for market, they're ready to go, but policy is still catching up. Markets are still a bit uncertain. Value chains are still being established. And you're not going to get certainty from market offtake. You're not going to get certainty from the investment community until you have a robust value chain, until you have some form of certainty in terms of policy development to actually uptake these technologies. Because it is a long road to develop these tech, and the timing of when these technologies can actually scale is something that is really important. So you often see these innovators trying to cobble together beachhead markets for them to ultimately achieve traction for their technologies, when in a fantastic system we would have alignment on a mission-driven approach to how to establish these policies and value chains around these core markets for them to step off onto.
Very interesting point, and maybe something we'll come back to in a bit. But before that, Shannon, can we get your take on this?
Yeah, so I think those are all true, and there's another aspect of that, which is there's no price on carbon today. So there's no true cost to a company for their emissions, except in a very few places where it is regulated with some sort of cap system. But for the most part, this is an unregulated market. In fact, the offset markets are even called the voluntary carbon market, which is, it's just indicative. It is a voluntary effort by the companies. And frankly, given that, it's amazing there's as much progress being made as there is. But with that voluntary aspect, there's uncertainty. and each company is making their own plan and their own targets on their own timelines. And so given that, there's just a lot of uncertainty as to where this market will evolve, what is going to be the expected, kind of what's going to be expected of companies, at what point do consumers or boards or stakeholders of many sorts, the pressure ultimately is just coming from them. And I think that is challenging. And I don't know the right answer on what regulation is needed on a global scale in particular. I think there are a lot of organizations that are starting to try to bring standards, but I think just this entire just the dynamic of the market being a voluntary market based on just companies wanting to do the right thing on their own timeline and on their own budget is making it challenging to get the kind of progress that we need.
Excellent, thank you, Shannon. And Emin, over to you.
Yeah, I'm gonna go on top of what Jim said about it's really all dependent on people. It's a really good point. Like when we look at any kind of huge transitions in the human history, it's always dependent on the behaviors of people. And if history has proven something, it's that you can't force you can't force anyone to into a change. It has to come from bottom up. I'm a huge believer in that. In that sense, I'm optimistic that the technologies in that sense will enable us to actually transition into these systems. But in order to do that, you have to make it more accessible and easier for people to actually go into renewable systems. So just an example, like most of the airline companies right now are actually providing some options to allow you to remove your carbon footprint with an extra cost. But no one, including myself, is actually willing to pay more for a plane ticket in order to reduce those carbon offsets, because we think psychologically that I'm not this huge money-making airline company. Why should I be the one to pay for this carbon removal ticket? But if we can actually use technology to make it more accessible, to make renewable more cost-effective, make it more optimized for anyone. In the stakeholders, anyone between the stakeholders, I think it will automatically develop itself. So I wanted to approach the topic from that perspective.
Yeah, no, very, very good point as well. Erstein, I think you've touched a little bit on some of this challenges with scaling here, but maybe is the focus on innovation? Is that where you see the challenge, or is it just kind of technological rollout? Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, we mentioned hard-to-abate sectors. I would argue for changing the term to maybe big opportunity sector. I meet a lot of companies who are saying that we are hard-to-abate, so we're in the steel, it's hard-to-abate, so we can't do anything. So I would argue that there is a tremendous opportunity, because if we manage to solve this, it's a massive challenge. But if we're able to solve this, we can also make a massive impact. It's a big opportunity. So I think that the key word on the challenges that you asked about is the scale itself. And taking again my industry's perspective from the deep sea shipping perspective. So the deep sea shipping perspective does not use any green energy today. They don't use any energy that you need to take off grid. So if we wanted to decarbonize shipping, and let's say we were able to jump onto e-methanol or e-ammonia tomorrow, that will require half the world's non-fossil energy to do that. And that's new energy, that's a new consumer that needs to take that energy. And then half the world's non-fossil energy has to be used in order to decarbonize one sector, representing 2% of global CO2 emissions. And we mentioned steel, cement, agriculture, buildings, etc. So there will be a massive competition for this green energy. And I think that just the scale is the biggest challenge. And as I mentioned, we get a lot of questions about the different alternative fuels, which are relevant for us. I think that it's very important to understand the massive challenge that it is to produce these fuels.
Yeah, I think some of the takeaways here are overall scale is impressed upon all of us. I think a lack of vision and clarity as well makes it difficult to move in this space, and the need to make it work for people, and making it low cost being one potential route in there. I mean, I think there's a bit of a temptation with this transition to try and centrally plan it, and there's many reasons why that doesn't work. But if there was anyone to centrally plan it, it would probably be you, Jim, because you're chair of the IPCC. Obviously, you stick to the science, but what actors and institutions would you be changing to try and advance this?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure that planning and IPCC go together, Mike, but the way we operate. But just to say, I mean, it's absolutely clear that the people who are going to execute the innovation are in the private sector. That's absolutely the case. But it's very important that governments play the big role in setting the rules of the game and facilitating the kind of approaches that are needed. You have already heard about the lack of carbon pricing. We have a wonderful set of statistics that 90% of the world's economy is covered by net zero targets. About half the emissions are covered by formal policies and institutions, and 20% are covered by some kind of carbon pricing. So basically you get big numbers when you're aspirational, and you get much smaller numbers when it comes to the actual mechanism of making change happen. So I think it is really important that government faces up to its central role in setting the rules of the game, through carbon pricing, through other mechanisms, through encouraging the kind of business models that you might need to help you put in place carbon capture projects, for example. And making sure that the rules are in place, that there is assurance around forestry-related projects, for example, that they are going to give you the kind of permanence that you need in order to have a really reliable investment. So I'm waving a couple of flags for governments at the moment.
Okay, so a step up in government action to kind of set the foundations for this a bit more concretely, and then the private sector can come in. I mean, I wonder, Ross, if you can speak to that, particularly from the earlier stage stuff. You've mentioned the difficulties in scaling some of this stuff. How ideally would that come together, and is there some best practice you can highlight there?
Yeah, it's a great example. Perhaps I can take an example from where we are in the hydrogen space. Right? So we have a lot of new hydrogen innovators that are at the point of commercialization today. They're trying to go to market. They're trying to access new off-takers, new corporates. They're looking at them and saying, okay, fantastic. Can you guarantee a hydrogen supply for your new hydrogen genset, zero-emission hydrogen genset? No, we can't. We don't have the production. Right. What is your unit cost? This is what it is. What is that based on? Assumptions around where the hydrogen price is going to be in the next few years. So it's really difficult to establish a business case and let's face it, a lot of these technologies still have some green premium on it, and it's not enough to go to a corporate and say, look, we're just going to decarbonize this part of your business. They want to see a commercial return to that as well. It's not enough to just say we're just going to decarbonize. There needs to be a tangible commercial return. So these are innovators, these are businesses. They have to have a solid commercial business case to them, and I think that's really where government plays in, right? They're the caretakers of the field, if you want. They need to establish policies. They need to direct investment and blended finance into the right areas. Large-scale industrial projects are really great at this because they create volume orders for different forms of technologies that can ultimately look at first-of-a-kind-based projects and scale from there. Because a lot of these innovators don't have, number one, that certainty of offtake, which is driven by policy. And because they don't have certainty of offtake, it's really difficult to secure Series B or scaled-based finance. There's a great example of H2 Steel, which has completely zero-emission steel production within the Nordics. That achieved an incredible amount of finance early on because they managed to secure that offtake and they managed to secure that volume. So it's all from a government-based perspective. It's about setting the rules that allow for the establishment of sustainable value chains, I mentioned earlier, directing investment into key projects to stimulate and provide cash for first-of-a-kind, large-scale commercial projects from an innovation-based perspective. And then lastly, working with the investment community and the financial community to bridge that challenge of not just developing a new prototype or trialing that prototype in a small-scale solution, but being able to actually scale deployment of that solution.
So again, kind of government-led, without that government certainty provided for the business models, you're not going to get that ultimate scale to convince everyone else to come on board.
Well, yeah, it's a massive opportunity, right? So if the solutions can be competitive at a price angle and you can guarantee supply, there's an opportunity there, and the government's role is to get products there.
And maybe to come to you, Øystein, are you seeing governments realize some of these opportunities? And maybe also, we talk about kind of green premium, high cost hydrogen. What do your customers say when you talk about some of these potential pathways?
So yeah, it's a complicated answer to that. First of all, taking again the global shipping perspective and deep sea perspective. So we're partly regulated by governments, and that's the kind of the blessing and the curse with it. In order to regulate global shipping, that's done by the IMO, the International Maritime Organizations, and the UN, and that means that it's challenging to get regulations through because it has to go all the way through the UN system, developed, and the developing country has to agree on it. That means that you can argue that they are slow. I think it's a landmark decision that was done by the IMO last year, that they actually decided that we will have aim to go to zero, which is also fantastic because that means that it's valid for everyone. It's for all countries. So you have a regulatory body that maybe seems a little bit slow compared to a local regulator, but when it comes to the decisions, it's equal playing field for all. So I think that is an essential part of a regulatory perspective for deep sea shipping. So whether the governments are doing enough, there will be also bilateral alternatives. I mentioned I was in the panel here earlier for those of you who were there, so I mentioned it again. One of the things that we are looking at is what we call the green corridor. And in order to make a green corridor, that's a good demonstration project. That is possible to run on a alternative fuel or a kind of a green route from A to B. It could be between Norway and UK. It can be from Rotterdam to Singapore on a green corridor. But in order to make that happen, you need to make sure that you're equalizing the difference between the alternative fuel, the kind of the green fuel, and the traditional fuel. And someone needs to pay for that. And that's the area where I think that we absolutely need to put a price on carbon, because that price can finance that gap. And it can finance that gap in a green corridor through contractual differences, and that's where governments can come in. So that means that, and I know that this is a topic that's discussed in many different countries, where if you have a corridor from the UK to Singapore, you need to have the governments in both ends in on it, and basically support that, and using contractual differences, and it can be financed if you put a levy on the fuel. And I think we have a great opportunity as well, because it is a price on carbon at the moment in the EU. You have the EU ETS system, which we fully support. We think it's a challenge because it's a regulatory scheme. We would like to have it on an IMO scheme. The IMO has an ambition to come up with new regulation now in order to achieve that zero target. They need to do something about the economic element. So I believe that there will be, and hope there will be, a price on carbon, and that creates a fantastic opportunity, because that means that there will be enormous amount of revenues coming from shipping companies into the different governments and into the system. But it needs to be used for transition itself. If it's just feeding other kind of economy, like I'm concerned about in the EU, that the shipping will now was entered into the ETS now this year. All the revenues coming into different governments, into the EU, it goes into other sectors and financing post-COVID measures, agriculture, etc. If it goes back to the innovation and actually drive transition, the sector can solve the problem themselves. And that's the long answer why I would argue for a strong price on carbon in a circular system driving transition.
And recycling it back to make sure it goes to bridging those green.
It goes into the actual transition. Yeah. Not just the tax. Then it's just annoying, right?
Yeah.
It has to go back to incentivize the developing countries as well, because that's where
to support their transition.
Yes.
Interesting. So just staying on the carbon pricing point for a moment, I think there's this idea of a global carbon price, which I think we can argue for many political reasons may not happen. But actually we're getting there via a patchwork of different solutions. The EU emissions trading scheme, voluntary carbon markets to some extent, indeed some of the incentives you've got in the US, and the EU's carbon border adjustment, which is going to incentivize essentially carbon prices on imported goods into the EU. Maybe, Shannon, to come to you, obviously you run a business which relies on carbon pricing. Is this patchwork enough for you, or what would you see change to give you more certainty in this landscape?
So I think that it's it makes it challenging right now to have so many different markets and in fact, even the carbon transactions that are public or the markets that are actually making public pricing available, a majority of carbon offset transactions are still done privately and not ever publicized. So there, among the carbon suppliers, there is this undercurrent of real demand to make carbon pricing more transparent. And now there are certain think tanks and research analytic firms that are asking us to put anonymous carbon pricing into their indices so that they can then publish much more robust carbon pricing information to the market, because carbon buyers, even if they would like to participate and get into the market and start actually contracting for carbon offsets across any number of different types, they just don't have a lot of confidence that they know what a good price is or a fair price. And so I think that the opaque markets in which these are currently transacted make it really difficult. But I think there are certain trends that are starting to come forth that are bringing a little bit more transparency to the market, and some buyers are starting to publish what they paid, some suppliers are starting to publish what they're getting, and I think that is helping just set some standards for what buyers should expect and what carbon should cost.
Interesting. So we're kind of getting this carbon pricing. Increased transparency will be fundamental to a lot of these business models that we need to see. We're slowly getting there, and hopefully that transparency will help. Maybe, Emin, to bring you in, it strikes me that your business is kind of at the cutting edge of working in markets where there may be a lack of transparency over business models and pricing and things like that. How do you act in that environment? And yeah, maybe you can start with that.
Yeah. What Jim said about when his opening speech about scaling up the energy transition from America, Europe, and China to other parts of the world, it's a really good point. Our main customers are from Turkey. It's an emerging market, but it's also a G20 country, so it's actually kind of like a bridge country that you can actually experiment with these policies and stuff. But one of the hardest barriers for the technology to actually penetrate is the regulatory side. And when I'm talking about regulations, low amount of regulations is a bad thing, but also high amount of regulation is also a bad thing. So when the market is highly regulated, it's hard for you to apply those regulations to your systems. But when there's no regulation at all, then it's really hard to develop a system to utilize in those markets. So as an example from our company and the Turkish market, the government doesn't need to improve any feed-in tariffs, or they don't need to provide an extra earning for the energy owners. They just need to have the right regulations for the energy markets. So, for instance, in UK there are some enhanced frequency regulation opportunities for energy storage assets, and that's how the batteries in the grid make most of the money. But in Turkey, all of the regulations are more focused for gas peaker plants, and some of the government officials, they don't even know what they don't know about the renewable energy transition, and they don't know which regulations they have to pass. They don't know what should be the market in terms of nudging the renewable energy assets. So I think it's very important, like Jim said, to increase these intergovernmental communications as well. And it will be very beneficial for emerging markets to learn from the mistakes and the opportunities from the more advanced markets.
Very interesting, thanks. So I think we've heard kind of how fundamental governments are to all of this, but we've also heard how they're often playing catch-up with some of the innovations and some of the business models that are coming out there. A question to any of you, really. What can non-government actors do to help governments get up to speed in this space so that they are more in line with the transition that we need to happen if we're going to get to global net zero? I don't know, Jim, if you'd like to start.
Well, there are an awful lot of different kinds of non-government actors out there. I mean, very obviously NGOs have a big role to play in creating the right kind of political environment in which governments take decisions. People like the Energy Transitions Commission that does a lot of the think tank kind of work, I think, is also important to come up with the kind of ideas that would allow governments to move forward. But I think there needs to be a huge number of conversations just between government and the private sector and the financial sector to make sure that the kind of frameworks that are put in place are actually fit for purpose. Just before I became chair of IPCC, I was chairing a Just Transition Commission in Scotland, which was a very important kind of dialogue between the Scottish government, businesses, trade unions, environmental groups. And these kinds of dialogues and conversations, I think, are really needed to move the agenda forward.
Excellent, thanks. Any other comments from anyone?
Yes, as a comment, if you, I remember I was at the COP in Glasgow, and I was reading the declaration afterwards, and we're looking for what they're going to say about shipping. Nothing. What they're going to say about private sector. Nothing. So when you're looking at the Paris Agreement itself and the declarations that are coming out of the COP, until recently at least, that doesn't mention private sector. It's the different governments that owns the responsibility and reporting on the NDCs. And I think that there should be a deeper connection with the private sector in that dialogue as well, because the private sector has also solutions and can contribute much further, especially in the dialogue now we're leading up to the next COP. So we see that there's a more and more private sector presence, but they're not deep into the kind of core of the discussions. There are always these kind of side events and presenting, but I think that definitely private sector should engage, and governments should engage with the private sector much more.
I think perhaps to just add to that as well, and particularly when it comes to earlier stage innovation, we have a term called the race to be second when it comes to adopting new technology within the climate aid space from the private sector perspective. No one wants to be the first to test and trial the technology, right? So there is that need for greater level of collaboration, not just at the later stage deployment of mature technologies, but also at that earlier stage. There is a strong interest for the private sector and for corporates to be involved at that level. But I think when it comes to really understanding and investing in first-of-a-kind projects, that's where they need to collaborate a lot more with government blended finance. First loss facilities, as an example, can be really effective in that, to be able to get innovators across that big commercial Series B hurdle for them to actually trial those technologies at scale. We don't have an early stage finance problem. I think there's a lot of questions of there's no money out there for innovation. There is, right? 3 billion in the UK alone from a venture capital perspective invested last year, and that's up from that's about 3x up from 2019. Right, and Europe is now the biggest market in terms of number of deals from a VC-based perspective signed in the world, and the UK is the biggest in Europe, right? So there's not a challenge when it comes to interest in the type of investors that are used to risk, right? That are used to adopting risk, looking for big payoffs. I think the challenge now is how do we collaborate with the private sector and how do we collaborate with institutional investors, banks, philanthropics to get those innovators over that scale and implementation hurdle.
An interesting collaboration challenge. Thank you. And Emin?
Yeah, if I may add, on top of what Ross said, I 100% agree that there is not a problem with the early stage investments. Like the energy transition is a fairly ambitious topic that everyone knows about, especially in the investor area. But the major problem is actually scaling up these innovations and businesses, because it's really hard to find an application area when it comes to finding actual clients and when it comes to developing actual projects. I think there are some very concrete things that the government side also can do in order to facilitate this stuff. I think it should be much easier to invest in a renewable energy asset when you compare it to the more traditional energy plants. But right now, I don't think it's the case, because everyone knows about how to invest in a gas power plant or a coal power plant, and you can get the process running more smoothly. But when it comes to a wind power plant or a solar power plant, you would need to have these insane amount of how can I say this, like insane amounts of permissions from governments for land usage. You need to have pre-analysis of the wind potential of that area, of the solar area, and all these are pre-investments for the money owners just maybe 2 years before the project actually starts, and people are not willing to pay that money at that early stage. So another very concrete thing is, I think there can be established some consortiums in between countries to, as I've said earlier, in order to share this knowledge between utilities also. So utilities are mostly private companies right now, but they are still heavily regulated by governments. So they're kind of like a hybrid private to government companies. And the amount of knowledge sharing between them is not really good, I think. So.
Interesting point, because I think we've heard about knowledge sharing between businesses and government, but it's kind of between businesses and various different private sector, finance sector participants is equally as important here. Shannon, any comment on this? You don't have to. We can move on to another one.
No, I think particularly in the U.S. where there are just, it's so decentralized, and the U.S. government is trying to figure out their role, and every state has their own policies and regulations, and the Biden administration just a few weeks ago came out and said that they support carbon offsets as part of a company's strategy, and I think those of us in the industry are like, okay, thanks. So I think a little bit more not so passive, a little more aggressive stance would be necessary to really have that play a vital role in the energy transition in the U.S.
Yeah, maybe a good example there of government catching up to what the private sector's been doing for quite some time there. We're going to open up to questions in the audience in just a few minutes, so do get thinking. I've got one more before we do that. Given the panel is on innovation, technology, disruption, I do want a quick take from the panelists of what innovation or disruption are you really excited about for the energy transition. And I'm sorry, Ross, but I'm going to pick on you first, because I think you said you work with over 400 climate startups. So there must be one that really excites you.
Yeah, I think I'm to go back to, maybe I can take it a full circle back to the beginning of this, and Jim was talking about hard-to-abate sectors. I think there's a lot of innovation now. Direct air capture is something that is still in its infancy, as well as CCUS to a certain degree. But there's a big focus now on what do we actually do with that captured carbon, or what do we do with embedded carbon from things like biochar within the agri-industry. And there's a lot of fantastic innovations coming out around how do we repurpose that captured carbon or biochar into different forms of plastics or polyols to be used in industry as an offtake, into sustainable air fuels. It's early days, as well as different forms of fuels for the marine industry. And so going back to that business case, the ability to leverage potentially a carbon price, as well as the opportunity to actually transform the byproduct of carbon capture into usable materials, and that to have an inherent value in it, is something that I think will be significant, and I think it's something that will definitely benefit things such as the hard-to-abate sectors, because ultimately CCUS is a bit of a, I guess it's necessary, but it's also got a bit of a risk to it, in the fact that it gives a bit of an open license for us to not change as fast as we need to change. But the reality is we need it, right? We need CCUS to get where we need to be, and we're going to use some form of direct air capture or sequestration for us to finally get to net zero. So the more we can improve that business case, the quicker the better.
Excellent. Jim, I think you're leaning to come in.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I do think that there are some technologies that once they get past a certain stage, they innovate by themselves and they move forward. And I would pick out solar PV, batteries, example, modular. The costs have fallen very quickly. I think the big challenge, I'm not sure if the word exciting is the word I would use, but I think where the most interesting challenges are with the big, very site-specific technologies like carbon capture, technologies associated with the steel industry, the cement industry, where it's much more like pushing the technology uphill, if you know what I mean. That's where it gets much, much tougher. There are different kinds of innovation needed, and it's this site-specific, large-scale, system-level stuff that I think is much harder.
Yeah, something we see as well. The more modular you make it, kind of the easier it is to disperse. It can go to multiple different applications. The more bespoke it is, the higher cost, the more complex, not seeing as much progress. Any other takers on this point?
maybe I can have can I have two different innovations that I can mention?
As long as they're quick.
Okay. The first one is, even though it's a little controversial, I believe there's a huge potential in modular nuclear reactors. They're very small nuclear power plants. The thing is, the upcoming challenge for the energy industry is the use of data centers for AI, right? And it will mean a huge electricity load for the electricity grids all over the world. And in order to energize those systems, you need actually a huge amount of generation as well. And small nuclear plants that are coupled with all these data centers is a good potential, I believe. The second one is it's a bundle of innovations actually, but it's the flexibility of the electricity grid. Like the two-sided energy supply chain would make a more flexible system, and it will actually drive down the emissions and the costs of the electricity, I believe, for especially huge metropolitan areas where you can actually get the benefit of using EVs, building flexibility, like grid management, all those stuff.
And quickly from my side, I fully agree with you. I think it's on the brink of being arrogant or not looking into all available energy sources when we have this big energy challenge. So I think we should really look into everything that can produce energy, including nuclear. And another thing is that we, going hundreds of years back, and again, wearing my shipping industry hat, we were sailing ships. And we used the energy directly from the wind with no energy loss directly into the sails. And we are going back there now. So we are fitting our big tankers with sails. So look out for that. Will big sails on chemical tankers, and that means that there's no energy loss on that. It's 100% of the energy from the wind directly into the sails. So it's a small thing, but still excited about it.
Yeah, very exciting indeed. Shannon.
Yeah, well, I love it that you're going back to wind to power ships across the ocean. And from our perspective, looking at forest-based carbon capture, there is a ton of innovation that's happening in MRV, so measurement, reporting, and verification, which is needed for any type of carbon measurement across any sector. But there is a lot that's happening within forests. And if we want forests to be a meaningful part of the solution, whether that's keeping the forests that we have across the globe or restoring forests where they've been deforested, we just need really cost-effective, efficient ways to measure that carbon. And so I think there are a lot of companies, a lot of startups that are doing MRV technology. At Chestnut Carbon, we actually have a proprietary handheld device that can very accurately measure carbon in trees, letting us cover a huge area very cost-effectively. But there are other companies that are doing remote sensing devices. They're doing drone seedling deployment so that they can cut down the cost of restoring forests by planting trees very cost effectively. So there's a lot in nature too.
Great. Well, that was an excellent survey of innovation disruption. Thanks very much. Let's go to questions from the audience. We've got one here and a gentleman over there. I believe some of the panelists will need to give up their microphones for this, if you wouldn't mind. And then we'll just pass them between us. So let's start with this lady here, please, and then the gentleman behind.
Hi, I'm Teresa. I'm a student doing climate change finance and investment in the University of Edinburgh. So thank you all for your sharing and insights. So I have one question for Jason. As we know, the maritime transport will soon be incorporated in ETS, and also the implementation of CBAM. Combined with the point you just mentioned, shipping sector is a kind of hard to abate sector. So I'm just wondering, what's your insights in terms of the impact of these regulations? By this I mean, will it be too overwhelming to motivate the shipping sector to decarbonize? And also, with the election of EU Parliament, is there any opportunity of deregulation in the future? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Let's go to the gentleman behind and then this lady up front, and then we'll take those three in turn.
Thank you, everyone. That was really insightful. With the discussion on scaling up, there was something that crossed my mind that I didn't hear mentioned, and I'm not saying it hasn't been considered, but I suppose whenever we think about scaling up technology, we have to think there's an upfront cost, but there's also an upfront carbon cost. And so the quicker that we intend to scale up, the sooner we have immediate carbon in the atmosphere through creating the technologies, and also the huge demand on the rare minerals. So is one of our objectives potentially to look at increasing that return on investment in terms of carbon as well as cost?
Great, thank you. And we've just got this lady at the front as well, please.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the introduction discussion. I'm Nikki from Climate Group. We're behind the RE100 campaign, and we're kind of looking at next steps now for RE100 leaders. And I'm pleased, Emin, that you addressed the elephant in the Excel Centre about nuclear, because that's on the agenda of what we're talking about corporate companies to do. So I kind of wanted to get a wider sentiment from the panel here, Carbon Trust and IPCC, to see what the sentiment is generally around nuclear and the use of nuclear, and this kind of high cost versus very low public acceptance around the use of nuclear.
Excellent, thank you. Let's go with those three for now, and then we'll take another set. Maybe Øystein, start with you on the CBAM shipping one.
Yeah, on the ETS. So a quick background: in the European Union, you have the emission trading system. It means it's a cap and trade system, and shipping was now included in that from this year. Shipping represents about 8% of the total volume, so that means that shipping needs to buy allowances in order to emit CO2. The way we think about this, coming back to the transparency, we look at this as a open book transfer cost. So basically what we're doing is that we are allocating the amount of CO2 that on the cargo that we are transporting and providing back that to the customer and said, this is the impact of the cargo that we have transported. So this is the impact for you, this is the price that you need to pay. So we don't earn anything, and we have been able to include that in our contracts. It's more challenging to do that on a spot rates, but we do it included in the spot rates. That two benefits. One is that it's more transparency. Now we get increased demand for reporting because of scope 1, 2, and 3. Companies need to report on their scope 1 and on scope 3, and when we provide them with that element, that goes directly into their carbon accounting on scope 3. So the exposure for us is minimum because we look at this as a transfer cost. If we are not able to do that, if the cost is at just a low, annoying level, it will just be another tax. So when people ask me about this, I would say that it needs to be at a significant size in order to drive behavior. Or else, because we need to remember why the system is there, because it needs to drive behavior. And also, one other under-communicated challenge with regards to the ETS is that with the current predictions, we will be running out of the EUAs in close to 2040. That's 10 years before the shipping industry has to go to zero. Last comment with regards to nuclear. My perspective on that, I think it will be challenging to have ships going around with nuclear reactors. There are there today. There are some military and they are state-owned. I think that is a shore-based challenge, and I think that you should utilize and think about all energy resources that is available to produce fuel and to decarbonize industries on the shore side.
Excellent, thank you, and two answers in one there. Thank you for that. And we've heard from Emin already on nuclear. Any other thoughts from the rest of the panel? Supportive, not supportive?
Yeah, I think I was specifically invited as IPCC, and just to say we're completely devoid of sentiment on the topic of nuclear power. We don't favour or oppose any particular technology. What has happened in the last cycle of the scenarios we assessed that are compatible with 1.5 or 2 degrees, there is an expansion of nuclear power globally in all of these scenarios, but it's not at the same scale as the expansion of renewables, which dominate the zero carbon technologies.
Interesting. Thank you. Ross, perspective on this?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to echo a bit of what you said there, Jim. In all the scenarios we've seen, nuclear is part of that energy mix. I think the one more comment I'd add there, just building on your point around other renewables, is that purely from a cost-based perspective and deployment-based perspective, solar, as an example, is just the cost reductions have been astronomical, and the deployment is scaling even faster. So it's not just a question of is it nuclear, is it solar, is it nuclear, is it wind? The likes likes of solar and wind, particularly when you start talking about, economic growth and where emissions are going to come from, is not from the EU in the future, right? It's from India, it's from Southeast Asia, it's from Africa, right? The ability to scale renewables in the sense of solar, wind, batteries can be far quicker and far more economical than the establishment of large-scale nuclear.
Yeah. Shannon, any thoughts on that, or return on carbon investment? Anybody?
Return on carbon investment, yeah. I should say in the last IPCC report, in the chapters on buildings and urban settlements, there was quite a lot of attention to embodied carbon in there. That is not necessarily the same for other sectors, and we are actually working out to have more collaboration with the sister assessment, the International Resources Panel, to address these issues more systematically, because very obviously the energy transition needs a lot of steel. It needs a lot of cement, and we do need to take account of that.
Maybe just a plug for some of our work on this, because we think perspective is quite important. We looked at the total embodied carbon of all critical materials, including steel, that you might need for a transition to net zero by mid-century. So it's something like 15 gigatons cumulatively overall. It's worth remembering we've got 40 gigatons per year from coal, gas and oil emitted every year. So it really is kind of that kind of perspective that's important here.
And just to add to that as well, we've learnt, right? So from the EV market, from the offshore wind market, when we're dealing with early stage innovators now, and when increasingly when venture capitalists are looking at early stage climate tech innovators, they're looking at carbon avoidance and footprints of those technologies. So when they're thinking about their scaling strategies, they are considering how do we scale in the best way possible that maintains that carbon benefit, right? That reduces our footprint and maximizes our carbon avoidance. So I think as newer technologies get into that point of scale, and ultimately as technologies are scaled across value chains that allow for greener steel, that allow for greener cement as an example, those technologies will hopefully, we've learned from the mistakes in the past and will get even better.
Well, and even adding on to that, it depends where in the technology development your investor is. So is it a venture capitalist that's looking for, a huge portfolio of very risky technologies in the hope that one or two of them is going to scale and skyrocket? Or are you looking more at private equity and asset management that is, kind of further along in the maturity scale and presumably lower expected returns but greater certainty, all the way to utility or, public funding of something that is more just almost a government investment. So where is this particular technology or way of pricing or thinking about carbon or carbon reduction, where is it on the development scale, and who is it that's investing that's going to drive what kind of return on carbon they need?
Just a little comment.
Very last point, Emin, and then we'll wrap. Yeah. Okay.
Like when it comes to the return on investment on carbon, it's really just a nice to have feature when you compare it to the return on investment on money, because of the thing that Shannon mentioned about the carbon pricing. When there's no carbon pricing at hand, it's really hard for companies to choose between two different investments and look at the carbon itself as an investment decision. It will always come down to the money. It will always come down to the short-term gains for the company. So we need to have an established carbon pricing mechanism to allow for that. And just a small addition on nuclear power plants maybe. What Ross said about the economics is I 100% agree, but there's also this side in the electricity management side, like the grid management side. What nuclear does for the energy grid and what solar and wind does for the energy grid are two totally different things. Like nuclear can work as a baseload system. So what nuclear replaces is not solar or wind, so it replaces the thermic power plants, the coal power plants, because they have to be up and running for 24/7. With wind and solar, it's an intermittent source, so it has to be supported with batteries and other stuff. So we need both of them, I think.
Excellent, thank you. We're going to have to wrap it up there. Sorry we didn't get a chance to do any more questions, but some of the panelists are probably sticking around afterwards if you really want to nag them on those. I hope you'll agree we've had a really rich discussion from the panel, so if you could join me in thanking Jim Ski, Ross Brutton, Shannon Smith, Emin Bato-Dizda and Øystein Jensen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.